First of all, I would like to thank Steve Clemens and the Atlantic team and the Bradleys for the invitation. It's great to be here, and it's great to be here with you, Mr. Secretary.
Oh, thank you very much for having me.
All right, so I want to start off by pointing out to you that not long ago, there was a map that was released. It became pretty popular on social media, and it talked about how many hours a person would have to work at minimum wage in order to afford to live on average in some of the states in the United States. And it came out to something like 92 hours in California, 98 hours in New York, north of 70 hours in both Texas and Colorado. Is there anything that public policy can do, and yourself being the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, is there and Urban Development, is there anything that public policy can do to alleviate what really is a crisis in housing affordability in much of the country?
That is a fantastic question and a very, very timely question in terms of the issues that folks are dealing with in their lives. There is an affordability crisis happening throughout the United States in cities big and small. So just to put a very fine point on it, the National Low-Income Housing Coalition over the summer released a report that said that there wasn't a single place in the United States, a single city of any size, where if you were working full-time minimum wage, you could afford the rent for a two-bedroom apartment, and only a very few places where you could get a one-bedroom. So what can we do? The answer is yes, we can do some things. Those fall into different categories. First of all, for years now, HUD has been making important investments so that affordable housing is possible. A good example of that is our home partnership dollars, also community development block grants. Out of Treasury, there's a low-income housing tax credit, which has been a fantastic spark for more affordable housing opportunities. So the number one thing that we can do is that we can invest in creating affordable housing opportunities. The second thing is that we can look at some of the rules and regulations that we have now and become more creative, either to preserve affordable housing or create more. A good example of that is something that we call a rental assistance demonstration project that started in 2012, which was understanding that we lose every year about 10,000 units of public housing to disrepair. Essentially, because Congress has not been allocating over the last couple of decades the needed money for renovation and repair to traditional public housing, 1.1 million units, we lose those 10,000 every year to disrepair. Essentially, this RAD partnered with the private sector and moved what was traditional public funding to voucher funding that is based in that project-based voucher funding, to make it possible to renovate units that were going into disrepair. So we preserve affordable housing options. And then the third thing I would say is, having been a mayor of a city, of San Antonio, you can see very clearly, whether we're talking about transportation or housing or education, the devolution that has occurred in terms of the need for states and local communities to make significant investments as well. Same thing is true for affordable housing. A good example of that was Austin, Texas, that a few years ago passed an affordable housing bond as part of their bond program that the voters approved. You're going to see, I bet, the cities that truly are serious about addressing this taking a leadership role more and more, because we have a Congress that for years now, the governing majority has not dedicated the resources that they ought to be dedicating to create more affordable housing opportunities.
Well, at the same time, and you mentioned Austin, Texas. Austin is one of the cities in the country that is experiencing what has become a controversial question, and that is gentrification. Yeah. And there's quite a debate that's going on in the sort of academic sphere over whether gentrification is real or whether it is just a way of vilifying sort of new entrants into America's urban centers and downtowns. But if you look at places like Portland, Oregon, Denver, Colorado, if you look at parts of New York City, and even this city, Washington, D.C., there is clearly a turnover in certain neighborhoods that used to be concentrated with the black and brown poor, which are rapidly turning over to very high rent, higher net worth residents, and the affordability gap then becomes even wider. It becomes even more difficult for people to live in those cities. again, looking at it from a public policy standpoint, are we over-subsidizing, for instance, developers who are pushing this kind of gentrification? And do you believe, as a public policy matter, that gentrification is a real and extant problem?
I do believe that in certain communities, they're caught in this vicious cycle that happens where in distressed areas, the city council will incentivize redevelopment, and that starts to pick up, and the place becomes cool. It's the place that folks want to live, and then somewhere it reaches a tipping point, and then it becomes more difficult either for folks who have lived there for a long time to stay there because the rents go up or their taxes go up, their property taxes, particularly in states that are heavily dependent on property taxes. And it also becomes more difficult for folks who are of modest means, who might be of the same demographic as the folks who used to live there. It becomes hard for them to take advantage of new opportunities in housing that exist. So when I got to HUD about 14 months ago, I told my staff, I really think that HUD has a leadership role to take in, putting together a commission or something to look at this issue of gentrification, because I hear it over and over, and I saw some of it beginning to happen in San Antonio as we revitalize the urban core. The challenge is that the research is actually bedevilingly inconclusive as to what extent gentrification happens and whether, when gentrification does happen, the folks who end up leaving, whether they actually end up benefiting more because there has not been sufficient longitudinal analysis of, okay, do they end up doubling up with someone? Do they end up in a neighborhood that is worse off, or do they end up in a higher opportunity neighborhood? So I would like, before the end of the term, to be able to figure out a way to robustly bring folks together to try and address that issue. I don't have any illusion that we're going to be able to solve that within the next 15 months before the Obama administration is done. But I do see a hunger out there in communities for figuring out a way to address this. And I cannot point to one single community, having been a mayor now and having visited a lot of cities as HUD secretary, where I say, you know what, they got it right. Like, they did a great job of catching this cycle and not letting it happen and getting a great balance. But the number one piece of advice that I would give communities is that when they start to see an area get revitalized, that they do everything that they can to invest in preserving affordable housing, in their incentives, lock in inclusionary policies that require some affordable housing to be a component of incentivized properties that are renovated or built, and that they work with those neighborhood residents to understand how they can better help them stay in those neighborhoods if they want to do that.
And one of the arguments by those who say that gentrification is a myth and that it isn't real is that they point to a 2014 study that found that, in fact, if you look at the period from 1970 to 2010, less than 5% of cities that were considered in the grips of extreme poverty actually saw the average income in those communities rise to the national average by 2010 from 1970. And then in that same time period, the number of residents of cities that are considered gripped by extreme poverty has doubled, something like 4 million Americans living under extreme poverty.
So they say, well, what do you mean that you have all these wealthier people that are moving?
Right.
And this is part of the challenge that I think is out there in terms of the research.
And so if, in fact, the real problem is extreme poverty, how does one get the kind of services, just basic services, streets that are cleaned properly, neighborhoods that are patrolled properly but not over-policed? Like, how do we get livable communities in cities where there is extensive poverty?
Well, I mean, number one is that I think an important movement that happened over the last 30 or 40 years is the creation of single-member districts in local governments. And that was a hard-fought victory to get that in most, and I think probably maybe now every big city in the United States. The significance of that is that you have districted representatives that are there to fight on the council for resources for their areas. you need a conscientious city council and mayor that are willing to make investments that are inclusive, that take into account the differential needs that exist across a city. In San Antonio, I used to say, look, we need to acknowledge that there are areas in our city that are newer areas and generally more well off. And there, the streets don't need as much investment. You won't find as much need for a summer nutrition program and some of the other social services, but you might find a greater need there for a fire station, because as the city grew, the fire stations and police stations were more clustered together in the older existing part of the city. And you have to be very cognizant of where the needs are, what they are, and then fair-minded about how you distribute those resources. The challenge is that in a lot of communities, there's a real tendency, I think, where we chase the glitzy kind of investments. And there's a certain cachet in that. And sometimes those investments help your city get ahead, whether it's a stadium or other types of high-profile investments. But for distressed communities, you need to make sure that you're investing in neighborhoods as well and in people. And I encourage, when I speak to mayors, for mayors not just to think about their cities in terms of those investments in infrastructure and the things that you can throw a stone at, but go beyond that into things like education and the environment and where, the conditions that people live in. If you can take that holistic view that the administration has tried to take with things like promise zones and promise neighborhoods and choice neighborhoods, I believe that that's a winning formula for helping to lift people up.
Well, we now have, of course, a very high-profile developer running for president and doing quite well in the polls, I should add, on the Republican side. And one of the things that Donald Trump is talking about is sort of rearranging, even though his plan doesn't actually do it, but saying that maybe we should tax the hedge fund guys a little bit more. Should we also think of developers in the same way? Are we over-subsidizing wealthy developers and really doing not enough to protect the homeowners who are sometimes having their properties targeted for taking?
Well, I think that, one of the ways that we try and encourage developers to create affordable housing is with the low-income housing tax credit. Now, we also have the mortgage interest deduction, and that touches many more Americans. There's an argument about whether, in terms of investing in affordable housing and opportunities for people, is the mortgage interest deduction really not necessarily giving more over to developers, but giving more over to wealthy upper middle class and folks versus middle class and lower middle class folks who own homes. And I think that we should have that conversation. I haven't seen the spectrum of data on that, but I think that that's an argument that deserves an airing. With regard to developers, I believe that the bargain is worth it if you can get good affordable housing opportunities out of it. It's some of these deals that sometimes you see in some local communities where the bar that's set for the amount of affordable housing that is created is probably not worth it.
Yeah.
And it varies, and the deals vary. But I think everyone would agree that you want to get as big a bang for your buck in terms of creating housing that is going to be affordable and remain affordable for the long haul. Because if not, then I don't think that the public, the government, should have as much of a role in subsidizing that.
Well, I would be remiss if I had you here and did not ask the question that I think is on a lot of people's minds when they think about you, Mr. Secretary, and that is, have you had entreaties or discussions with the Clinton campaign, with the Hillary Clinton campaign, about potentially running for vice president?
I have not.
And you... I had to ask. And you, of course, are from Texas, which, among other things, is a state with a tremendously high Latino population, but that does not vote at its population strength. Actually, not even close to it, something like half of its voting strength. What do you think would make the difference in increasing voter participation among Latinos?
A number of things. You're right. African Americans in 2012 voted at a rate of 66%, whites at 65%. Latinos at 48. And in Texas, the rate of voting for Latinos, Texan Latinos, is 10% less, I believe, than California Latinos. So even among those states, there's a difference. A number of things. What Battleground Texas is doing down there, which is good old-fashioned organizing and getting people registered to vote, reaching out to them. Also, candidates that can speak to what people actually care about and connect with them and get people excited. And I think, and this is sort of a longer-term thing, is an improved education process. I mean, folks have probably read about the debacle of these history books and science courses down there in Texas, and what happens over time is that has an impact not just on knowledge but on civic engagement, because you're raising a generation of folks, who is not as versed in good history and understanding of different issues. I think if you could change that, get that on a stronger track and a more accurate track, that over the long haul you would have more engagement.
Yeah, and in wrapping, do you believe that the sort of caustic nature of the immigration debate will drive up Latino turnout in 2016?
I believe that in 2016 you're going to have a record Latino turnout, and I'll thank Donald Trump in part for that. I'm not sure that the Republican Party will thank you for it, but I do believe that you're going to have a record turnout among Latinos, also among Asian Americans, and that it bodes well for the Democratic Party.
All right, well, I will presume to speak for the Atlantic and say that if you do get that call from the Clinton campaign, we'd love to
You'll
hear
be the
from you
first to
and find
know.
out. Call me first. And just our friends here. We'll be the only ones who know. We won't tell. All right, Secretary Julián Castro, thank you very much.
Thank y'all.
And now, please